right, so you ready to dive into this stack of notes you sent over? Looks like we're really getting into conflict resolution and human behavior this time, huh? With a little evolutionary psychology thrown in for good measure.
Absolutely. Should be a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, I'm really drawn to this note about Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate.
Hmm.
This whole idea that our ancestors, actually evolved to be vengeful, that's pretty wild.
It's a fascinating concept, right?
Definitely. So in a world without, like, laws and police, having a reputation for retaliation, it was basically
Yeah.
essential, right?
Exactly. It was about survival. Pinker calls it credible deterrence, basically. If you're known to retaliate if you're wronged, it discourages aggression in the first place.
Wow. It's kind of a dark way to think about it.
Hmm.
But I guess in those times, it makes a lot of sense.
It does, and it makes you appreciate how far we've come, right? Pinker actually argues that the establishment of law enforcement, of systems of justice, that's what really led to this huge decrease in violence throughout history.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it's like we created these systems to basically outsource our need for revenge.
Precisely. It takes that burden off the individual and places it on society as a whole. But it makes you wonder, right? What happens when those structures break down?
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Mm.
Like in natural disasters or times of war when we often see these spikes in
Yeah,
violence.
exactly. It's almost like those primal instincts we've been talking about,
Hmm.
those deeply ingrained responses to threat. They're just below the surface, waiting to reemerge when those social contracts are strained.
It's a little unsettling when you think about it like that.
It is. It highlights just how important those systems of law and order really are for keeping a lid on things.
For sure. And speaking of keeping things in check, you've also got some notes here about game theory and, get this, the tit-for-tat strategy. And this apparently isn't just a human thing, right?
Not at all. It pops up everywhere in nature. It's this surprisingly effective approach to conflict resolution, this really beautiful balance of like punishment and forgiveness.
Okay, now I need an example because that sounds kind of contradictory.
Sure, think about vampire bats. Researchers have actually observed this. So if a mother bat doesn't do her part, contribute to feeding the young, the other bats, they won't share food with her.
Like they just cut her off.
Huh.
Brutal.
It is, but it's also incredibly effective. It sends a very clear message. You cooperate, you get rewarded, you betray, and there are consequences.
And no room for misinterpretation with those bats, huh?
Right. But here's the thing. With humans, things aren't always so clear-cut, are they? We misread signals, we misinterpret intentions, and suddenly we're in this escalating conflict cycle, tit-for-tatting our way into a bigger mess.
It's like that thing where communication breaks down
Mm-hmm.
and one person is just asking for a glass of water and the other person hears, "You never do anything for me."
Exactly. It's not about the water anymore. It's about these deeper dynamics that haven't been addressed. And I think that's where this Cartman drama triangle comes in, which you have a note on here.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so remind me, what is the drama triangle again?
So it's this model that basically describes how people can get stuck in these unhealthy roles during conflict. The victim, the rescuer, and the persecutor.
Oh, right. And we all know someone who seems to be perpetually stuck in one of those roles, right?
Right.
But we can get caught in that trap too, can't we?
Absolutely. We might jump in to rescue someone without realizing that we're actually enabling their behavior, for example. Or we might cast ourselves as the victim without realizing how that keeps us stuck.
Yeah, it's all about awareness, isn't it? Recognizing those patterns in ourselves and others.
Exactly. And that's where this connection to our evolutionary past comes into play. It's not about excusing bad behavior, but realizing that these primal instincts are still a part of who we are. So understanding them can actually help us make more conscious choices about how we respond to conflict in our lives.
It's like we're trying to reconcile our ancient brains with the complexities of modern life.
Precisely. And speaking of reconciling seemingly contradictory ideas, you have a note here about epigenetics, the idea that our environment, our experiences, can actually influence which of our genes are expressed.
Right, and that kind of throws the whole nature versus nurture debate out the window, doesn't it? It's not one or the other. It's this fascinating interplay between the two.
Exactly. And it really underscores how much our experiences matter. For instance, there's this fascinating research by Robert Sapolsky. He studies baboons.
Baboons, okay, I'm
Yeah.
intrigued. Go on.
So he found that baboons who experienced adversity early in life, like growing up in a really stressful troop with limited resources, they showed changes in gene expression later on that actually made them more prone to aggression and impulsive behavior.
So their environment, it was literally getting under their skin. impacting them on a biological level.
It appears so. And while his research is focused on baboons, of course, it raises some really interesting questions about human behavior, right?
Yeah, like a difficult childhood, poverty, exposure to violence. If those things could have a similar impact on gene expression in humans, what does that mean for how we approach things like crime or addiction?
Exactly. It's a lot to unpack, but it highlights that our experiences really do shape us on a fundamental level. And while we can't change the past, understanding the long-term impact of those experiences can help us create more supportive environments, right? For ourselves and for future generations.
Absolutely. And speaking of positive influences, you have a note here about oxytocin, which is often called the love hormone, right?
Right. And as you might guess, it's actually a bit more nuanced than that.
Isn't it always? So we know that oxytocin is involved in bonding and trust, particularly between mothers and infants and in romantic relationships. But there's another side to it, isn't there?
Exactly. And it has to do with the groups we belong to. It seems like oxytocin strengthens those bonds within a group, but then on the flip side, it can actually increase distrust and even aggression towards people outside that group.
So it's kind of like it's not just about lovey-dovey feelings. It's more about loyalty and protecting your own tribe.
Yeah, exactly. It really highlights how complex social behavior is. Even our biology, it seems, is influenced by context.
Wow. So it's like, depending on the situation, oxytocin can either bring people together or drive them apart.
It seems that way. There was this study where they gave people a dose of oxytocin and then had them play this economic game.
Okay, what kind of game are we talking about here?
So in this game, they had to make decisions about cooperating with other players or, being more self-interested.
Okay, got it. So what happened?
Well, people who got that oxytocin boost, they were more likely to cooperate with players they saw as being in their in-group, part of their team.
That makes sense. But what about the other players?
That's the interesting part. They were more likely to punish players from the out-group, even if it meant losing money themselves.
Wow, that's kind of cutthroat. So even though it's called the love hormone, it can actually make people more competitive and even hostile in some cases.
It seems so. It really underscores how powerful those group dynamics can be, right? And how easily we can slip into us versus them thinking.
It's true. And speaking of those kind of unconscious biases, you have a note here about naive realism that I wanted to ask you about.
Yes. Naive realism. It's this idea that we all tend to believe that our own view of the world is not just one perspective, it's the objective truth.
And everyone else is just wrong.
Exactly. We forget that everyone else is also looking at the world through their own lens, shaped by their own experiences and biases.
It's like we're all walking around with these invisible filters on, and we don't even realize it.
Exactly. It reminds me of this classic study. Researchers, they asked people to choose which sock from a pair was the better sock.
Okay, so were they different colors?
Yeah.
Different materials?
Nope. They were identical socks.
So how could one be better than the other?
That's the point. But people still showed a preference. Overwhelmingly, they chose the sock on the left.
Really? Why the left sock?
The researchers think it might be because we read from left to right, so maybe our brains are just wired to favor that side.
That's wild. It's even with something as simple as choosing a sock, there are these underlying biases shaping our decisions, and we're totally oblivious.
It just goes to show those unconscious influences are everywhere.
So if we're hardwired for this naive realism, how do we break free from it? How do we become more open to other perspectives?
Well, I think empathy plays a huge role here, which we touched on earlier.
Right, and not just understanding someone's point of view intellectually, but really trying to connect with how they're feeling.
Exactly. Putting yourself in their shoes, trying to see the world through their eyes.
There's that great quote by Harper Lee in To Kill a Mockingbird. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it.
It's so true. And while reading can certainly broaden our perspectives, I think engaging with people who are different from us, having those real-life conversations, that's essential for overcoming this naive realism.
I completely agree. It's about actively seeking out those different viewpoints, those experiences that challenge our assumptions.
Exactly. Because sometimes that can be uncomfortable, right? Confronting our own biases and prejudices.
Oh, absolutely. But as they say, growth often happens outside our comfort zones.
It's true. And remember, we as humans are hardwired for connection. Empathy is that bridge that allows us to connect with others, even when it's challenging.
That's a great way to put it. So we're talking about expanding our perspectives both intellectually and emotionally.
Exactly. And that leads us to perhaps the most challenging perspective, to shift our relationship with our own inner world. And this note you have here about guilt and delayed gratification is a great example of that.
Yeah, guilt. Always a timely topic, especially after the holidays. It's funny you mentioned delayed gratification because I swear I experience way less guilt when there's some time between, like, making a decision and actually doing the thing.
It's true. It's a real phenomenon.
Like, if I just buy something on impulse, I'm hit with that buyer's remorse almost immediately.
Right, that instant regret.
But if I add stuff to my online cart and then I wait a few days before actually hitting purchase, I can usually convince myself I'm being, more responsible.
You're definitely onto something. It turns out we really do experience less guilt when there's a delay like that. The research actually backs that up.
So that gap between the decision and the action, that's the key.
It seems to be. It's like our brains kind of trick us into thinking we've made a more rational, less impulsive choice, even if it's really the same choice.
That's kind of sneaky of our brains when you think about it.
It is, but it also speaks to this really fascinating relationship between our conscious and unconscious minds, and how our perception of time, it plays into all of that.
It's like time itself is another lens we're looking through.
Exactly.
So where does this deep dive leave us? We've covered so much ground, from the biology of our brains to the sweep of history, the power of perspective.
It's been quite a journey, but I think it all comes back to this idea that our understanding of the world and of ourselves, it's always evolving.
There's always more to learn, more to question, more to discover.
And that's what makes this whole human experience so incredibly fascinating, don't you think?
It really is. This deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. Until next time.